So the title that I actually gave two titles to today's message. And the title that was on the announcement is, What Are You For Giving? As two words. So I'm going to start with something that I am for giving. I am for giving great gratitude. I have a brand new hip. It's 4 weeks old, and a week after my new hip, when I was already walking around the apartment without a cane and feeling so pleased with my progress, I dropped a bottle of prune juice, because those of you who have ever taken medication for pain, prune juice eases the flow. And then I fell on the top of my foot. And I was in shock. That's the gift of shock. I didn't realize how severely I had injured my foot on the same side as my hip. And that was on a Saturday night. And I called the doctor's office and spoke with a nurse on Sunday, and then I called my surgeon's office again on Monday, crying and so angry with myself for not being more careful, for not having eaten enough that day so that I wasn't as mindful. And I'm crying on the phone, worried that now that I can't walk, that's not going to be good for my hip. It's going to become stiffer, because taking care of my foot meant staying in bed and keeping my foot up. And so after crying and feeling terrible about myself for about 20 minutes, this thought walked across my mind. And the thought was, you didn't harm your hip. And at that moment, I had forgiven myself. And I have not had one sense of, how could this have happened to you? Why did this happen to you? Why weren't you more careful? And I am thrilled to be here today, walking without a cane, walking in the streets of New York, of Manhattan without a cane. And so that's what I'm for giving. Because when we think about forgiveness and we break it into the two words, it's important to keep in mind that when we hold resentment, anger, the desire for revenge, that sense of, you don't deserve my forgiveness, because if I forgive you, then you may think that I'm condoning that behavior and just act that way again. And what's most important about this is that the experience of revenge is going through my body. The experience of being a victim is going through my body. So why do we forgive? We forgive to keep our hearts open, not only to the flow of love coming in, but to the flow of love going out. So, as many of you know, I come here with notes, and now I'm looking for my notes. And then sometimes I actually read something from my notes. And so there's some quotes that I've come across about forgiveness. And one is from Ernest Holmes. And Ernest Holmes, one of the founders of New Thought, religious science. And what Ernest Holmes says is, the mind which condemns understands not the truth of being, and the heart which would shut the door of its bosom to one who is mistaken strangles its own life, closing its eyes to the greater vision. The biggest life is the one which includes the most. the heart which would shut the door of its bosom to one who is mistaken. And what's the mistake? What are we really forgiving? We're forgiving ignorance, not stupidity, but we're forgiving others, and particularly ourselves, for forgetting that we are one. For forgetting that when I hold on to resentment, that I am resending. When you look at the word resentment, it has re and sent in it. We are resending those feelings of revenge and anger. And I want to be really clear. I'm not saying this means that you're going to leave here today and never be angry again. I was on that call, my doctor's office, crying, and the thoughts going through my mind were, why wasn't I paying more attention? Why didn't I eat more that day so I'd have more energy? Why was I walking without the cane at that moment? I mean, all of those feelings were real. But because I have done these practices for over 50 years, I was awake enough to the thought that was, hey, you didn't harm your hip. And so there's no more resending to do of, I should have, if only. Why did I do this? And so I have a story to share with you. In 2006, I co-wrote a book called With Forgiveness. And during that time, we did calls twice a week with people who were part of our forgiveness community. And one day I was leading the call, and there was a woman who was having a problem. She wanted some coaching. And she was furious with her former husband. And she started to tell a story about something to do with their children, and he did the same thing that he did when they were married, which I have to admit the thought in my mind was, well, he's doing what he always did. Why is that surprising to you? But she talked for a bit longer, and then I said to her, I was curious, how long have you been divorced? And she said 23 years. And it was clear, the problem was no longer about her husband's behavior. The problem was her attachment to either he should be different than he is, why hasn't he changed? I've told him so often that he shouldn't do what he does, and he doesn't listen to me. And so, again, this doesn't mean that every moment each one of us is going to be walking around with wings and our heart wide open and everything is so wonderful. But what it means is when we hold on to the wounds of the past, when a current situation scratches that wound, not only are we dealing with the present situation, but all of the baggage, all of the resentment, all of the sense of being a victim surfaces. And that became so clear to me when I realized in my crying and anger at myself, being so pissed off at myself, I was not reaching back into old stuff to grow this anger, and there's something wrong with me, I'm not careful enough. That's the power of forgiveness. The past can be healed in the present, because when we hold on to the past, and when we ruminate about it, and when we're seduced by those past wounds, they become our present. And is that the gift that you are forgiving yourself? My guess is it isn't. And so I have some other keys I'd like to go over with you, some concepts that have been important to me about forgiveness. So Can anybody guess what I might have and what they look like? Keys. So for those, let me say something. They're all different. So I ask you to strengthen the trust muscle. Choose and trust that whichever one you choose is the perfect one for you. So those of you who haven't heard me speak before, I give out charms. And part of it is I think this is an enchanted place. I was talking with someone earlier about, I was talking with Lisa earlier about when you walk in here on a Sunday morning, there's this wonderful feeling. So I need reminders. I need reminders to keep my heart open. I need reminders to be true to myself. I need reminders to speak my truth. And so as I go over some of these concepts, I ask you to endow your key with whatever has special meaning to you. So this charm will serve as a reminder for you to ideally be for giving love in whatever way that's expressed. So I have another quote. This is from Nelson Mandela. And he was in prison for a very long time, a very small prison that was just large enough for him to stretch out. Very small, not prison, prison cell. So here are his words. As I walked out the door toward my freedom, I knew that if I did not leave all the anger, hatred, and bitterness behind, that I would still be in prison. And many of us have spent many years being imprisoned by wounds, by traumas. And that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with us. But when we know better, when we know that, that not forgiving is a sign of forgetting, of being mistaken, that we're not children of God. When we forget that, and it was in the song this morning, love is my decision. No one else can make me forgive. When we forget that, we walk around with cells, with bars around our heart. And many of us have forgotten where the key is. And the key is in love. So, as I said earlier, one of the main keys is we forgive, in a sense, out of selfishness. We forgive to free our hearts from the prison of resentment and trauma, not to pretend it didn't happen, the hurts didn't happen, but to no longer carry that baggage and that burden that blocks the flow of our love to others as well as the flow of love into our hearts. And forgiveness is something that's really best to be practiced on a regular basis. You know, Jesus said, when asked about forgiveness, that we should forgive 7 times 70. That's 490 times. And that number has to do with the Jews being enslaved. I think of the 490 times as the reminder is, it's not like, oh, I've forgiven, I'm done. Because have you ever woken up in the morning and you meditated, you wrote in your journal, you may have gone for a walk at the beach, you've eaten healthy food, you get into your car, you're on top of the world, and the car in front of you is going slower than you think a car should be going? and then you have an attitude about that driver, and maybe you pass that driver and then you see that person and then you make up even more stories about them, when we have no idea what's going on in the life of that person at that particular moment. So the opportunities to forgive are infinite. And I encourage you to start the day by asking, what am I forgiving today? It can be kindness. It can be a sense of humor. It could be hugs. It could be all of the myriad ways that love is expressed. And have that be your focus for the day. Have that be what you intend, what you tend to in the garden within you, and then you express outside. And love can be expressed by seeing the cashier in a supermarket and simply saying thank you to that person. If someone's bagging your groceries, say thank you to that person. But to really take a look at what are the ways that love is expressed in our world. And then, how do we know that we've forgiven? Well, on one of those calls that I mentioned, the forgiveness call, at another time, somebody wanted some coaching and started out by saying, I've forgiven my mother-in-law. I just don't see her and I can't talk about her. That's not forgiveness. That's a level of it. You may not be able to see, and I'm using the word able purposely, see the person. You may not have the capacity to see them right away because the wound inside is large, and it may take some time to truly detach and let go. But the way you know you've truly forgiven is when you can see the person and the experience becomes a teaching story. You're either feeling neutral or you feel a sense of love for the experience, for the door in your heart that it opened. So I'm going to leave you with this story. I don't remember if I've told this story in here before. But I married my college sweetheart, and after 8 years, we divorced. A few years later, I was telling my boyfriend, my current boyfriend, that we had taken a lot of movies together with my former husband. And he said, I'd love to see some of those movies. It would be great to see, to see those movies of you 10 years ago, 5 years ago. And so I said, okay, and I wrote to my former husband and said, would you please send me a copy of the movies? And he wrote back, and on hospice stationery, he was director of a hospice program. And he wrote back, I have thought about your requests and I am not sending the movies. And I thought, what is wrong with you? And then I thought, maybe it's because I didn't send him money to make copies of these movies. So then I wrote to him again with an attitude, because I was right, that, here's the money, please make copies of these movies for me. And you're director of a hospice program, and some of these movies are of my dead father, and so please send them. So, you could hear the chip on my shoulder. I was not giving love at that moment at all. So I a few weeks later, get another letter back, and he said, I will decide who gets to see the movies I make. These are home movies. So I thought, this guy really has a problem. A few weeks later, some of you are familiar with the Open Center in Manhattan. It had just opened maybe the year before or that year, and there was going to be a session on forgiveness. And I went with a friend, and she leads us, the woman who's leading it, whose name is Robin Casajarian. She did a lot of work in prisons with prison population on forgiveness. And she said, close your eyes and you'll see a door on the right. I know this is your left. You'll see a door on the right and it will open and somebody will come and forgive that person. So my former husband comes and he's standing in front of me in this visualization. And in my head, I'm saying very clearly, I forgive you for having an affair. I forgive you for being unavailable when my dad was dying. You know, whatever. Those were the two main things I was forgiving him for. And then I heard another voice. And it came from here, and it was a simple sentence. And my experience is that God, Goddess, love speaks in very simple sentences. And the sentence was, I forgive you for loving me. And the visualization was over, and I thought, whoa, this is a big one. And over the next few days, I thought about it and was just open to, what's this about? And I thought, I didn't love me. How could I possibly receive the love from someone else when I didn't believe I was worthy, when I didn't believe I was thin enough, when I didn't believe I was pretty enough, when I didn't believe I was deserving? And 10 days later, I'm in New Hampshire where we had been together, and I'm in a giant supermarket, like the size of King Cullen, Bridgehampton. And I know he's in the supermarket. And I walk up and down the aisles and I see him and I say, hello. He says, hello. And he said, did you get the movies? I sent them to you about 10 days ago. Now, in my mind, there's no question that my capacity to forgive allowed these loving times that we had together to show up in a supermarket in New Hampshire on New Year's Eve. So I leave you with the question, what are you forgiving?